Good evening. I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News Weekend. There is no evidence of homicide in the death of Linda Mary Beardy. That's according to Winnipeg Police Service. Her body was discovered by workers at the Brady landfill on Monday afternoon. Police Chief Danny Smythe provided an update on the investigation on Thursday. He said an autopsy showed Beardy had injuries consistent with being in a garbage truck. They're still awaiting toxicology results, but investigators were able to track Beardy's movements to mid-Monday morning.
She was positively identified attending a retail store on Pembina Highway. She was seen exiting the store alone and was seen attending to a nearby refuse bin at approximately 11:14 in the morning. And she was actually observed to climb into the bin on her own. Now, there was some activity observed within the bin, and after a short period of time, there was no further activity observed, but she was not observed climbing out of the bin.
You can find more on that story over on our website, aptnnews.ca. RCMP in the Yukon have laid their first manslaughter charge in connection to an opioid overdose death. Here's Sarah Connors with more.
For the first time in the Yukon, RCMP have charged someone with manslaughter in relation to an overdose death. Yukon RCMP say 32-year-old Jared Skookum has been charged with manslaughter in the death of Stephanie Pye. The 36-year-old Casca and Tlingit woman from Watson Lake was found deceased in Whitehorse in April 2022. It was later determined she died from an opioid overdose. Skookum is already facing trafficking charges related to an investigation into Pye's death. Police in other places like BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan have laid manslaughter charges in relation to overdose deaths. Pye's family says they're not speaking to the media right now, but her sister says they're heartbroken over her death and Skookum needs to be held responsible. Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
It's been a little over a week since the Cuisance sisters were released on bail after they were released from custody pending the outcome of a judicial review into their 30-year incarceration. Their return to society came with detailed bail plans that could become the norm. Leanne Sanders takes a closer look.
There always has to be a first case, and those first cases are often kind of special cases.
Deanna Harris is the regional director for legal aid in Yorkton. She worked alongside Innocence Canada's James Lockyer in securing Odelia and Narissa Cuisance's release from custody after 3 decades in the justice system.
It does take time for people to transition back into a civilian family, a civilian environment.
But the judge gave legal aid a blueprint.
He laid out a number of very specific things, including how are you going to address potential employment or financial stability? How are you going to address a transition back into a family home? How are you going to address counseling, cultural counseling?
Harris approached Yorkton Tribal Council and the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations to help come up with Odelia and Narissa's bail plans, which includes getting driver's licenses so they can take part in family life, go to counseling, and get jobs.
It's often just very general. If there's a program that is available, you will take it. But we were able to make it pretty specific because we contacted the service providers directly.
Harris believes this case will help lawyers help their clients in other cases. And Harris also believes with the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the justice system, there will be more wrongful conviction cases down the road.
We know that these cases exist. Our justice system deals with so many people every day that we have to understand that it's impossible for these cases not to exist. The justice system makes mistakes. That's why this ministerial review process is in place. That's why the law is being changed around the process, because it's very cumbersome and it takes a long time.
Harris says the ultimate goal is to have Odelia living happily with her family and for Narissa to contribute to society in the way she wants to by helping marginalized people and women in her community. The ministerial review deciding their fate could take years before it's complete. The sisters were found guilty of second-degree murder in 1994 for the death of Anthony Joseph Dolph. Leanne Sanders, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
The Assembly of First Nations and Cindy Blackstock announced a $23 billion deal to compensate survivors of the First Nations child welfare system. Negotiations on compensation started when the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled that Canada discriminated against on-reserve First Nations children in care. But the deal has gone through a number of rocky periods to get to this point. Cindy Blackstock, head of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Centre, spoke with us earlier.
Cindy, thanks so much for joining us here. 6 months ago, a similar deal to this one was shut down by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. What is different with this settlement agreement?
Well, what the tribunal found is that people who were eligible for $40,000 under its order, some of them were disentitled under the previous FSA. This agreement makes sure that everyone who's entitled to Canadian Human Rights Tribunal compensation will receive that compensation. And it also recognizes the injustices for people who are outside the timeframes of those orders, meaning people from 1991 to 2006. There's been an increase in over $3 billion to make sure that the people who are left behind are now included in this deal.
Now, Cindy, you had a number of concerns about the original deal. Have they addressed those concerns with this deal?
Yeah, we did have a number of concerns, and yes, they are addressed. So key things that we were concerned about before is that children who are placed in a non-Government of Canada funded placement, like staying with a neighbor, but they had to go there and be separated from their families due to lack of prevention services, those kids were disentitled under the previous final settlement agreement. They're now included in this one. And also the estates of parents. Those were disentitled under the previous final settlement agreement. That's included here. And we also have more supports for children under the agreement to make sure when they reach the age of majority, there's more supports available to them. So there's been a lot of fixes, and I think now that we have an agreement that recognizes the injustices of all the victims, but will also satisfy the tribunal's orders.
Now, you had just mentioned also previously that this agreement is worth $3 billion more than the original. So what has been added?
So monies for the disentitled victims, about $90 million in supports for children who are reaching the age of majority and will be entitled to compensation. It's really those two kind of key items that make up the bulk of the $3 billion.
And last one for you here, Cindy. When do you see compensation starting to flow?
So there's a bunch of steps that would need to still happen. One is First Nations leadership need to make a decision about this final settlement agreement tomorrow. Then we have to go back to the tribunal and let them know that we heard them in the first order and that there's now fixes in this agreement and everyone will get their compensation. Ask them to make a decision as to whether they feel it satisfies their orders. Then off to federal court and then to get the approval there. So those three pieces, and we're looking at in terms of time frame 9 to 12 months.
All right. Well, Cindy, we appreciate you bringing us this update here. We thank you so much.
Hey, thank you for having me, Daryl.
It's a tale of two northern BC communities brought together by amalgamation in the 1950s. That has led to a housing crisis, according to some critics. APTN's Lee Wilson has the first of a two-part story.
Winnipeg, or Fort Babine, was a community of abundance before amalgamation. The community is located nearly 100 kilometers north of what is now known as the town of Smithers in northern BC. For generations, they fished successfully using the weir system, a wooden structure that directs and traps fish. But in 1904, the federal government closed the weirs in Lake Babine due to the impacts on the salmon stream. Fred William is a Winnipeg elder. He has worked as a member of their treaty team. He says in 1957, federal Indian agents, including one named Damaris, combined two bands, Old Fort Babine and Fort Babine into Lake Babine Nation to make travel and administration easier.
He amalgamated all Fort Band, which is our neighboring band, and Fort Babine Band, our parent band. This is our mother reserve.
William says the people of the smaller Fort Babine were pressured to move by the government. They were also offered jobs in nearby sawmills.
You move out, you can get a job. You can, yeah, so they did. But what about us that stayed behind? We stayed behind because we believe that this is our land, because we believe in our titles and rights.
Many Fort Babine members moved to Wyoming Reserve in Burns Lake, which now has nearly 1,000 residents. Others chose to stay in Fort Babine, which now has an estimated 60 members on reserve.
All of a sudden we became the outland community. And that Burns Lake Reserve, they were encroaching on Burns Lake Band Reserve, and they became the main office, and we became the satellite. Yet everything's so backwards. I'm just getting tired of this.
Robbie Reed is one of 2 councillors for Fort Babine, part of the Lake Babine Nation. He shared Fort Babine members have been raising concerns about a mounting housing crisis. He says for decades they've been asking Lake Babine Nation for renovations or new housing.
I've been pushing for stuff, for, asking this, we need things done, housing, but we don't have any control over it.
Calls to Lake Babine Nation have not been answered. For the last 11 years, Bessie West has been a councillor for Fort Babine. She is concerned for the community and believes their way of life is being impacted.
Even more diminished. Our services are disappearing. Our school is open 4 days a week, not 5 days a week. And all those decisions was made for us. We never ask.
Lee Wilson, APTN National News, Fort Babine.
Time to step aside for a quick break, but stick around. There's much more to come. Welcome back. A small First Nation in BC is taking on the provincial government over what they're calling a colonial practice of granting mines access without consent. APTN's Tina House has more.
Leaders of the Kikatla Nation are in Vancouver to fight for their inherent Indigenous rights in Supreme Court. They oppose what they see as an archaic Mineral Tenure Act. With the click of a mouse and $25, anyone can buy a hectare of land at $1.75 per hectare for mining purposes. According to the Kikatla Nation, no consent or consultation is required with the nation, and no notification is sent saying that their traditional territory is being mined. West Coast environmental law lawyer Jessica Klog says the act is unjust.
As if their inherent rights, their inherent title, their ayok, their laws did not exist. Gigatla says that this was a breach of the Crown's constitutional duties to Gigatla and did not align with the human rights standards set out in the UN Declaration, including the standard of free, prior, and informed consent.
Banks Island is located near Haida Gwaii and Prince Rupert. The Kikatla consider it within their traditional territory. Banks Island is the site of the Yellow Giant gold mine, which failed to get environmental assessment in 2015. The mine later went on to pollute toxic tailings in salmon-bearing water bodies around the island, leading to charges that forced them into bankruptcy. According to the chief counselor of the Kikatla Nation, Linda Ennis, the damage is still felt to this day.
Kikatla people have lived with the consequences of bad mining practices for years. Prospecting camps and mining operations polluting our lakes and salmon streams, impacting our resources, our medicine, and our people for generations to come.
And as the leaders of the Kitkatla march down the street towards BC Supreme Court for their first day of hearings, many here are hopeful that the court will rule in their favor. Jamie Neen is with Mining Watch Canada. He says this is an important case that he also hopes will set precedent in how governments should respect Indigenous rights and title.
We're hopeful that it will be a game changer, really. I mean, we're looking at something called free entry, which is the principle that mining can go anywhere it wants in the country. And that's been challenged in a number of jurisdictions, and it's been modified, shall we say, in the Northwest Territories, in Quebec and Ontario. It hasn't really been tackled in BC, and it certainly has not been brought up to the standard of free prior informed consent.
And for the next 2 weeks, the BC Supreme Court will hear from the Kitkatla Nation. We'll keep you updated as this case evolves. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
While Northerners are known for their storytelling, they aren't necessarily the ones telling them. But a new journalism training program being offered in Inuvik, Northwest Territories, is hoping to change that. Our reporter Charlotte Moore-Jacobs has that story.
Newsrooms in the north are saturated with journalists from the south. Many stay briefly and then move on to bigger centres. But the Northern Journalism Training Institute is hoping to change that. This week kicks off a boot camp style course aiming to inspire participants to tell their own stories, the way they know they should be told in the north.
They're working with equipment and they get to work with software from the beginning, so that they have all 4 weeks to be practicing it and using it. And we're using like open source software. You know, we're not using cost barrier equipment.
Haida and Northern journalist and project lead Kayla Jefford Moore says along with cultivating research skills and applying reporting skills for different mediums, participants gain an understanding of media literacy.
Like, what are your rights as a journalist? You know, what are you allowed to shoot? What is consent? You know, what are some of the legal jargon of like off the record, on background, you know, things like that. As well as talking about what the people you're interviewing and what their rights are and what your rights might be as someone who's being interviewed.
The 4-week program is being held in Inuvik on Inuvialuit and Gwich'in homelands. Participant Monica Lorraine Dillon already works in content creation for Western Arctic Youth Collective and is taking the training to build skills in podcast production.
Today that there are facts out there, but there's not a lot of truth out there. And like with journalism, it's really important to make sure there's truth to the facts. And we do have a lot of non-Indigenous people reporting on Indigenous communities, a lot who aren't trauma-informed or even know the people in the community. So it's coming from either more of an opinion or biased piece.
Around a dozen participants from the NWT will learn from guest speakers and work placements. Like Julie Beaver, whose background is in counseling and on-the-land wellness, but who has recently decided to change careers.
Bring your outdoor gear. We're going to be out and about. And I thought, yes, you know, that's what I like. I'm more of a hands-on person. That's what most Indigenous people are. We want to get out there. We want to experience, you know, things. We don't want to be just sitting in the classroom. And so that was great to hear.
The free training is in partnership with Journalists for Human Rights and supported by Google News Initiative. Charlotte Moore-Jacobs, APTN National News, Yellowknife.
Coming up after the break, how to get more Indigenous music on the airwaves in Quebec. Stick around. Welcome back. Musicians in Quebec are saying Indigenous music needs to have more airtime. They're now demanding a 5% quota of Indigenous music in radio stations across Canada. Amelia Fournier has the story.
The word Kashtin means tornado in the Innu language, which is fitting since the Innu folk rock duo took the mainstream media world by storm in the 1980s. But Florent Vallant of Kashtin says in the early 90s something shifted.
On était rendu dans les palmarès tout ça en 1990, mais à la crise d'Oka, ils nous ont retirés, disons, parce que pour eux, notre musique pouvait être dangereuse. Puis ils nous ont retirés pendant la crise, nous disant qu'ils vont nous remettre par après. Chose qui n'est jamais arrivée encore. C'est pour ça qu'on fait la demande aujourd'hui, pour qu'on puisse être reconnu.
Fast forward to 2023. This group, made up of First Nations musicians, leaders, and non-Indigenous allies in Quebec, still sees a gap.
Ce serait tout à fait dommage qu'on ne nous connaisse plus, qu'on ne nous connaisse pas. Ce serait le temps qu'on nous connaisse.
They're asking the CRTC to implement a 5% quota of Indigenous music radio airtime. A public consultation and survey conducted last summer found almost 95% of respondents supported this idea.
Il y a des jeunes artistes qui ont juste besoin qu'on finance leur projet pour marcher dans les pas de Florent.
Popular Quebec artist Émile Bilodeau is not Indigenous, but he's sick of how Indigenous artists are treated in his province.
On part avec le cash, nous autres, là, les francophones. Là. Les radios, c'est beaucoup de sous. Puis on fait aucune place à ces gens-là, tu sais, qui nous ont permis de nous établir ici.
Florent Valent's son, Mathieu Mackenzie, is also a musician.
On a de la misère à aller dans les radios, dans les autres radios.
He runs Makusham Music, Inc., a production company on their territory of Weshat Makmaniu Tanem, and sees an abundance of Indigenous talent firsthand.
On a beaucoup d'artistes émergents dans la communauté, dans les communautés au Québec, puis pas juste au Québec, à travers le Canada. On nous entend pas assez.
According to a 2021 study by ADZISC, a Quebec Music Association, Indigenous artists are, quote, nearly absent, end quote, from airwaves and get less than 1% of radio airtime in Quebec. Last year, Anishinaabe artist Samian was booted off a festival lineup for not having enough French content to play at a festival, kickstarting a discussion about inclusivity and diversity in the music scene.
On défend tous les artistes producteurs autochtones de musique autochtone.
But Mackenzie is optimistic this attitude is quickly fading from institutions.
Je pense que les festivals, les radios, les diffuseurs culturels vont donner de plus en plus de place aux artistes autochtones, puis de le faire dans leur propre langue. Puis je pense moi, je vois cette lumière-là. Je le vois, je le sens, je le vis parce que je suis dans le milieu culturel. Puis je sens l'appui des gens, puis l'ouverture des gens.
In an email statement to APTN, the CRTC says they will examine their recommendations and start, quote, a process of consultation, end quote, which is music to Florent Valent's ears.
On demande d'être écouté, d'être entendu. C'est ce que je voulais dire.
Emilia Fournier, APTN National News, Montreal.
And that is all the time we have for your APTN National News for this weekend. For news anytime, visit our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.